Welcome again to the podcast on faith, emancipation, faith, power, and emancipation, rather, based on this book. And my name is Professor Januarius Asongu. I am the author and host. Today, we are going to get to part four. Part four is entitled Building Freedom Before Victory. And then we would focus on chapter 10, which is entitled State in Waiting, Institution Building, Gradual Governance, and Experimental Sovereignty. In our previous episode, we completed part 3, Ethics and the Ethics of Liberative Resistance. Together, we explored what it means to resist oppression with integrity. We reflected on the moral discipline of nonviolent resistance, the strategic wisdom of David's confronting Goliath, and the importance of cognitive liberation in an age where information itself has become the battlefield. Those chapters taught us an essential lesson. Winning the struggle against oppression is not enough. Resistance itself must be truthful, disciplined, and morally accountable. Today, however, we begin an entirely new section of the book. Welcome to part 4, Building Freedom Before Victory. This is in many ways the most practical section of the entire book. Throughout history, liberation movements have devoted enormous energy on defeating oppression. Far fewer have devoted equal energy on preparing for what comes afterwards. And yet, history repeatedly teaches us the same lesson. Many revolutions fail not because they cannot overthrow injustice, but because they are unprepared to govern once victory arrives. This is the challenge before us. Our focus is chapter 10, State in Waiting, Institution Building, Gradual Governance, and Experimental Sovereignty. One of the greatest mistakes political movements make is assuming that freedom begins on the day victory is declared. It does not. Freedom begins long before that. It begins whenever people start learning how to govern themselves responsibly. This is one of the central ideas of liberative realism. A society cannot suddenly become democratic simply because an election takes place. It cannot suddenly become just because an oppressive government collapses. Institutions capable of sustaining freedom must already exist, or at least be in the process of being built. Otherwise, the collapse of one form of domination simply creates space for another. History often History offers many examples. Countries have celebrated independence only to descend into dictatorship. Revolutions have removed tyrants only to produce new tyrants. Liberation movements have won political power while losing the moral and institutional foundations necessary to preserve liberty. Why does this happen? Because institutions cannot be improvised. Trust cannot be manufactured overnight. Responsible leadership cannot simply be announced. These realities must be cultivated over time. That is why I introduced the idea of a state in waiting. By this, I do not simply mean a future government. I mean a community that is already practicing the habits of responsible self government before it formally assumes political authority. Imagine two liberation movements. One spends all of its energy fighting the existing government. The other fights injustice, but simultaneously develops schools, train future civil servants, prepare ethical leaders, establish transparent financial systems, encourage civic education, and creates mechanisms for accountability. Which movement is more likely to succeed after victory? The answer seems obvious. Yet, remarkably, few movements devote sufficient attention to this second task. They prepare for revolution, they do not prepare for governance. Liberative realism insists that these two responsibilities cannot be separated. Indeed, the struggle for justice must itself become a school for good government. The idea of closely connected, the idea is closely connected to one another. Important concepts discussed. The idea is closely connected to another important concept discussed in this chapter: gradual governance. Modern politics often celebrate dramatic change. We admire revolutions. We celebrate decisive moments. We imagine history changing overnight. Reality is usually far less dramatic. Healthy institutions grow gradually. Courts develop credibility over decades. Universities establish reputation over generations. Civil servants or civil service becomes professional through continuous learning. Democracy itself matures through repeated practice. Freedom is not built through one spectacular event, it is built through thousands of ordinary acts of responsibility. That insight resonates deeply with the philosophy of Karl Popper, whose idea of piecemeal social engineering emphasizes careful incremental reform rather than sweeping ideological transformation. I believe Popper's insights becomes even more compelling when viewed through the lens of critical synthetic realism. If human knowledge remains incomplete, then responsible political reform must remain open to correction. We learn by doing, we improve through experience, we adopt through humility. This leads to another idea introduced in this chapter: experimental sovereignty. The phrase may sound unusual, but its meaning is straightforward. Communities aspiring to self government should begin practicing self government wherever they responsibly can. They should develop local institutions, educational systems, community organizations, professional associations, independent media, conflict resolution mechanisms, transparent financial practices. Every successful institution becomes evidence that responsible governance is possible. In other words, sovereignty is not simply declared, it is demonstrated. This principle applies far beyond national liberation movement. It applies to churches, universities, businesses, families, even individuals. Character develops through practice. Leadership develops through responsibility. Freedom develops through disciplined self-government. This is why I believe institution building is itself a moral activity. An honest court is a moral achievement. A trustworthy university is a moral achievement. A transparent government agency is a moral achievement. A competent public health system is a moral achievement. These institutions protect human dignity, not because they are perfect, but because they create stable environments within which truth, justice, and accountability can flourish. Throughout this book, I have argued that liberation is more than resistance. Here we begin to see what that means in practice. Liberation must become construction, not only saying no to oppression, but saying yes to responsibility, not only dismantling injustice, but patiently building justice, not only imagining freedom, but learning how to sustain it. That ultimately is the purpose of a state in waiting. It prepares people not merely to inherit power, but to exercise power wisely. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons of history. Winning political authority is difficult. using political authority responsibly is even more difficult. That is why the work of institution building cannot wait until after liberation. It must begin today, long before victory arrives. Uh, long before victory arrives, long before constitutions are written, long before government changes, before governments change, because the habits developed through the struggle will become the foundations of the society that eventually emerges. That is the vision of liberative realism. Freedom is not an event, it is, it is a disciplined process of forming persons, institutions, and communities capable of governing themselves according to truth, justice, and human dignity. Thank you for joining me. In our next episode, we are going to go to chapter 11, Democracy in Waiting, Resisting the Authoritarian Drift. Again, if you enjoyed this, click like, make a comment, share it with others, and consider buying a copy of this book. Thank you.